Welcome, welcome, Approaches Human Geography class. It's the 24th of November. Well, actually, it's the 20th of November when I'm recording this, but basically this class, or these classes are meant to cover the 24th of November and the 26th of November. So November is nearly over, guys. You can almost smell the end of the semester at this stage. Even though, well, how many weeks are still left? There's still still 4 weeks left, including this week. But the end of the semester is very close. And the end of this module is perhaps even closer. Not the actual end of the module, because you know what, whether I'm on campus or not on campus, I'll always go to the bitter end. But what I mean by this is the end of this module in terms of new content is getting very close. I did promise you at the very beginning, at the very get-go, that I wouldn't overload you with content on this module this year. And I said basically the last 2 or 3, definitely the last 2 weeks, but maybe the last 2 or 3 weeks, the main focus really will be on revision, getting you up and ready for the exam, picking out some key ideas, key themes throughout the module. So today's lecture, well, today I'll probably do Monday and Wednesday's lectures all in one go like I did last week. So today's lecture, looking at it in this regard, we're getting very near the end of the module. So after this week's set of lectures, there'll be just one more week of new lecture content, and then that is it for the module. So this is literally the second last week of new lecture content. And then, as I said, last 2 weeks, all going well, I might be back on campus. If not, you'll have to listen to my dulcet tones online for the last 2 weeks. But the last 2 weeks, we're into revision mode. We're into getting ready for exams. We're into what are the big themes, making sense of the big themes. And I'm also going to be in that second last week of the module, probably the Wednesday, all going well. I'll also give you a bit of a prep session on how to, maybe the Monday or the Wednesday, think about that anyway. Because Wednesday, you're more, to be honest, let's think about this. To be honest, most of you are more likely to be in on the Monday than at 10 o'clock than on the Wednesday at 9. So I might do the exam prep class maybe on the Monday instead of the Wednesday on mature recollections. Anyway, if you have any thoughts, opinions, comments on this, get back to me, shout at me, etc. So what I'm doing in these 2 weeks of lectures, including last week's lecture and this week's lecture, are going through some of the key themes, key ideas, new approaches associated with the geographies of postmodernity. So effectively, geography from the 1990s onwards. You could almost say 21st century geography. You could almost say modern geography, contemporary geography. The key readings remain the same as for last week's, so you'll see the same reading list here. Now, we're getting near the end of the module, and hopefully some of you have been, at least some of you have been dipping into readings as you've been going through the module. But as I said, try at this stage, you're at this, where are we? We're at the end of November. You're at the stage now where being able to draw, where it's a good thing to be able to draw ideas from the reading material. So what I always say is, I don't expect you to read all the readings, but try to do maybe at this stage, late November, early December, when obviously you have a lot of assignments due around this time of the year. You might have time to do extra reading at this time of the year, but maybe once the assignment overload ends, maybe in a few weeks' time, maybe when you get to kind of the second last week of term, try to catch up on the readings if you're not able to do them at this stage. Hopefully, by the time you get to the last 2 weeks of the semester, you'll have a better idea on, okay, what would be, looking ahead to the exam, what would be really important chapters in Creswell for me to read, depending on my particular interest? What would be really important chapters in Dyke and Jeffrey to read, depending on my particular interests, looking ahead to the exam, and so on. Definitely have a look at Mark Byles' chapter. You may have got that book in first year, so that's a good kind of overall summary. And there's no reason why you shouldn't dip into that chapter at some times. Don't tell him I said that, because it'll big up his ego. Other readings as well, guys, and blah. Johnson Sidway, I think probably the latest version, there's probably a few more chapters, to be honest. that are of relevance to the study of postmodernity. But you'll see Johnson and Sidaway's book, it's a bit older now. I think the last edition was in the mid-2010s. It's a bit older now, and it doesn't give as much prominence to postmodern geographies. It gives a lot more prominence to quantitative geographies, and that does reflect the fact that Ron Johnston himself was very much coming from that quantitative school, and what a legend that man was. Okay, there's going to be a lot of isms today. I'll be honest. I'm not going to get into these isms in a lot of detail. I'm not going to over elaborate on these. What I'm going to do in these lectures, I'll give you the broad brushstrokes. If you want an expert lecture on post-structuralism, I'm sure there's others in the department who can give you that. If you want expert information on post-structuralism and post-structural geographies, of course, definitely read more in the books. But really, in these last 3 weeks of lectures, I'm including this week, last week, and next week. In these last 3 weeks of, lectures with new content, lectures with new ideas, with basically the last 3 lectures of new content that you might want to cover in the exam. In these last few weeks, try to pull out what do you think the big things, the big ideas are. What do you think are the big trends that you see as characterizing 21st century geography? That's the way to think about it. Rather than feel you need to know everything you need to know about post-structuralism. Nobody needs to know that, guys. Rather than thinking you need to know everything you need to know about postmodern. So try and get focused on what you think are the big trends in geography. What has been the main contributions made to geography during this period? Whether in last week's lectures it's contributions from postmodern geographies, whether it's post-structural geographies and post-colonial geographies, or feminist geographies in our applied geography in this set of lectures, or next week, contributions made by those in critical geographies. So that's the way to think about it, in my opinion. So post-structuralism, I'll come back to this in more detail when I move on to talk about post-structuralism. We're going to say post-structuralism, the big concepts or the big terms in post-structuralism associated with Michel Foucault. Discourse is a big concept, big term. And another big concept or term in post-structuralism, post-structuralist thought, associated with another French philosopher. These French philosophers, guys, don't you just love them? Deconstruction. So both Foucault and Derrida, they talk about discourse, and ultimately all these big fancy words, your discourses, your deconstructions, they're all really ultimately focused on language. So when Derrida and Foucault are talking about discourse, it says it's about emphasizing the primacy of the words we use, the concepts they embody, and the rules they develop within the group about what are appropriate ways of talking about things. So ultimately, a lot of the big ideas in post-structuralism has to do with the use of language. Post-structuralism, and this is a key term, so the concept, the idea of representation. How things can be represented by language, by cultural practices, by symbolic practices. And the idea that all these different practices express power and constitute power. Post-structuralism has a big issue with categories. So it's a big issue with hierarchies, dividing, it's a big issue with dividing things into different categories, such as men and women, north and south, nature and society, which is a big problem for a subject like geography, because there's a lot of what geography is about differences. So what's the difference between place and space and so on. Ultimately, language is one of the key concerns within post-structural thought. And ultimately, post-structuralists argue that language itself, the written word, is a social creation. Ultimately, it's shaped by the social context. So texts, according to the post-structuralist worldview, texts will reflect the intentions of the author but also reflect the wider context in which they were composed, and the wider context in which their author or authors were socialized. So the big term in post-structuralism is discourse, as we saw a few slides back with our good friend Michel Foucault. Ultimately, for the post-structuralists, discourses form the big structures in which texts are constructed and which texts are read. So discourses combine narratives, concepts, and ideologies, different ways of trying to understand the world. According to the post-structuralists, discourses constitute the limits within which ideas and practices are considered to be natural. And we'll come across this idea again next week when you look at critical geographies and we look at the ideas of Tim Creswell. You've all heard of Tim Creswell, but we look at his views on place and how he'll talk about how certain practices are ultimately socialized. People are socialized into believing that certain practices are natural within place and other practices are seen not to be natural. They're seen to be out of place. So we'll talk about Creswell's ideas of in place and out of place. So this idea, it's not a million miles away from this idea. So according to Derrida, identities are discursively constructed and need to be deconstructed. And this leads you on then to say you can open up the meanings of different concepts, including geography and geographical concepts. You know what, part of me is thinking like life's too short, but hey, if you like post-structuralism, I won't do you down in this lecture. So post-structuralism, it's got a big issue with categories, as I said before. It's a big issue with trying to impose a sense of order in the world. And as such, it critiques geography for this, for imposing a sense of order in the world by, as it says, inventing the concepts of place, space, and nature, to which any self-respecting geographer would say, all right, mate, whatever you're having, you know what, makes sense to us. Other post-structures, others will argue that maps are also, could be looked on in a similar way. So someone like Harley would say that maps are cultural texts. Basically, their production is governed by cultural factors as well as scientific rules. Effectively, they imply what he says called a hierarchicalization of space. So what Harley's getting at here is that he says, what determines what is put on maps and what determines what is not put on maps? Post-structural thinking is perhaps most significant or most evident in terms of geography, in terms of the geographies of gender and the geographies of sexuality. And you'll see elements of that running through modern feminist geographies. And we will talk about modern feminist geographies in this set of lectures. So post-structural geography, ultimately, what is it interested with? It's interested with how places are represented. What are the languages and images used when you're talking about different places? And sometimes it's not the factual terms that are interesting. Sometimes it's the stereotypes that are more interesting. So the way that people might talk about places that they don't really know, and they might talk about places in such a way that ultimately what they're talking about really is not facts and figures about those places, but stereotypes about those places. So ultimately, and we'll see that with post-colonial geography, where post-colonial geographers talk about how the old places that would have been previously colonies of Britain, France, Germany, and so on, how these places were represented in the worldview of the colonial powers. So the big focus here is on how places are represented, and also how stereotypes, misrepresentations can be created of different places. A lot of times they're other places, O-T-H-E-R, if you can't understand my Midlands accent, how other places are represented. Places that are far away from kind of the viewer, or far away from the person who's told about these places. Sometimes they may not be physically very far away, but they could be culturally far away. So, for instance, Australia is a lot far away, is much further away from the British Isles than places like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, but culturally, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan is much further away to people in the British Isles than Australia is. Now, representations, the big focus isn't on the truth of these representations, as it says there. The big focus is on the work that these representations do in the world. So if you get certain representations being created of places, certain stereotypes, what is the knock-on effect of these? If they're positive representations, generally that's going to make people feel positive, warmly towards these places. If the representations, however, are complex, they're negative, then you can get negative feelings being created towards those places. Mark Boyle talks a lot about this when he's talking about post-structural. He talks about basically what the work that people in Glasgow did in the 1980s to try and rectify the representations of Glasgow. So Glasgow in the 1970s, 1980s, I talked about this when I was talking about look in the locality studies, new regional geography lecture. I talked about the knock-on effects of deindustrialization and how this impacted on places like the north of England, South Wales, but also South Central Scotland. So the old industrial heartlands of Britain that went into more or less terminal decline in the latter part of the 20th century. And Glasgow was one of these big industrial cities. So in the 70s, 80s, there was a general sense that there was very negative representations being created of Glasgow, some of which may have been grounded in fact. There was this declining city, this dangerous city. So in the 1980s, the work that was done in Glasgow was to try and create a different representation, a different image of Glasgow. So as you'll see then with the Mr. Men, the Glasgow's Miles Better campaign. In 1990, there's a lot less going on in 1990 when Glasgow was created as a cultural capital in Europe. And this is you see this a lot with other cities today. They attempt to try and create new representations of the city, more positive representations, moving away from the kind of the perception you get of a city as being this kind of derelict industrial wasteland to, oh, you're now thinking of Glasgow as a smiley Mr. Man. Wow, Glasgow smiles better. No, I heard Glasgow was this derelict urban city, but no, smiles better. You know what? I think I'll visit Glasgow. Damn it. Just now, one element or one movement within post-structural geographies is critical geopolitics. Now, way back in September, when we were looking at environmental determinism, I introduced you to a number of people who were involved in the field of classic geopolitics or classical geopolitics. Friedrich Ratzel in Germany in the late 1800s and Halford Mackinder in Britain in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Now, critical geopolitics, one of the things it tries to do is reimagine or re-engage with the old classic geopolitical discourses of Halford Mackinder, Ratzel, and all the other geographers who were associated with the classical geopolitics of the late 1800s, early 1900s. Generally, if you look at the work of people associated with this approach, particularly, say, Jerry Cairns, those of you who do GY307 will know this. Generally, it's the general worldview of people involved in critical geopolitics is of classical geopolitics. It's generally not a very positive view of the work of classical geopolitics. Generally, it's low. Generally, people working in the field of critical geopolitics. Critical geopolitics as a field, by the way, was established in the 1990s. And the lead person associated was a man called Garrod O'Toole, who I'll come back to in a minute. But people involved in this field, their way of thinking about geopolitics is very different from people like Mackinder, the way that people like Mackinder and Ratzel talked about geopolitics 100 years earlier. Uh, Garrod O'Toole is the person who's probably most associated with the field of critical geopolitics. And he's interesting because what year are we now? 20, roughly about 43 years ago, he was sitting in the exact same spot that you were sitting. Well, yeah, maybe if you're sitting in the arts block, maybe he was sitting in the exact same spot. But yeah, Garrod O'Toole is, he did his undergraduate degree, he's from Monaghan, he did his undergraduate degree in Maynooth, he studied geography and history, went on to study in the USA, and ultimately went on to become one of the leading geographers in the world and the lead person in this field of critical geopolitics. So for O'Toole, critical geopolitics concerns, he says, the construction of boundaries of inside and outside, here and there, the domestic and the foreign. So you can see again this post-structural trends, the focus on language, the focus on the creation of categories. And also, as we'll see in the last point, the focus on the language, the use of language, and how the use of language can have consequences, it can have effects. So what's of interest to O'Toole and people working in the field of critical geopolitics is the language that is used in the practice of international politics. But they're not just interested in the language used by governments or what they might call elite narratives, they're also interested in the language used by the media, by popular culture, in what they call popular narratives. And they say, well, the language used by governments can have power, but the language or the images created by media, the media, especially the language and images created of other places, can be as powerful, if not more powerful. And ultimately can sometimes be used to kind of support the language and ideas of the elite narratives. So ultimately, as Flint and Taylor suggests, critical geopolitics is about interrogating the implicit meanings that are given to places and the explicit meanings in order to justify political or geopolitical actions. So the idea that if you can create certain images or stereotypes or representations of a place, a different place to your place and other place, you can use these as a means of justifying certain geopolitical actions. So the example that's often used here relates to the Gulf War in the early 2000s. So in the run-up to the invasion of Iraq in 2003, there were certain images being created. So the image of Iraq as a failed state. Iraq was constantly referred to as a failed state. There was a knock-on effect to this image because if you talk about a state, generally if you apply the laws of international politics, other countries are not allowed to interfere in the internal affairs of a state. But in the run-up to the Gulf War, this image or concept of Iraq as being a failed state, ultimately it was kind of suggesting, okay, it's a state, but it's a failed state. So ultimately, the normal rules of international law really doesn't apply to this state. Another image that was used in relation to Iraq was the image put forward by George Bush II and others, the image of the axis of evil, the idea that Iran, Iraq, and North Korea form this axis of evil, which ultimately, if you're talking about a place that's been part of an axis of evil, obviously, if you get this across to the public and they buy into this idea, obviously it can justify nearly any political action or geopolitical action. So critical geopolitics is about looking at the assumptions that are used in the practices of foreign policy, but also the language that's used. And it studies the way in which politicians and the media represent other places as well as their strategic significance. The big question here, as with post-structural thought, is representation. How it can be used to frame our perspective on international politics, how it can be used to frame our understanding or our perspectives on conflicts involving the major superpowers in the world, the dominant powers. We're not necessarily talking about physical conflicts, out and out wars, but conflicts of ideas. So the conflicts the conflict for dominance between, say, the USA on the one hand, China on the other, and Russia on the other hand. So it's interested in language, it's interested in the texts of international relations, it's interested, as I said before, how the media and politicians represent different places and their strategic significance, and it argues that the construction of images used in foreign policy is itself a geopolitical act. Okay, moving on to postcolonial geographies, and there is a certain, you'll see there is a lot of overlap between postmodern geographies, poststructural geographies, postcolonial geographies, and also feminist geographies, and so on. So postcolonial geography, you can almost think of it as almost a very delayed reaction to environmental determinism. One of the big trends or big focuses running through postcolonial geography, and you'll also see elements, I should say, of postcolonial geography running through critical geopolitics as well. So postcolonial geography, poststructural geography, there's a large degree of overlaps or interlinkages between them, and basically someone could be really operating out of both approaches in terms of the way they're approaching different topics. So a big element of postcolonial geography is a recognition that of geography's history. Now remember, right back at the start of the module, right back at the start of the story of geography, right back at the start of the story of geography as an academic discipline, we looked at environmental determinism. And we also looked at the role played by geographical societies and indeed map makers in the imperial project. So a big element of postcolonial geography is to recognize that geography and academic geography has this relationship with imperialism, with colonialism, but also the racial strands. We talked about the elements of that running through parts of environmental determinism in the late 1800s and early 1900s. The big influence, or the most influential book in terms of post-colonial thought, is a book by Edward Said in 1978 called Orientalism. And most of the significant geographers associated with this, probably the most significant geographer of all is a man called Derek Gregory. They will draw a lot on Edward Said's Orientalism. Ultimately, in this book, there's a claim that people in the West created an imaginative geography of the Orient as part of the imperialist project. So what's the Orient? The Orient has different meanings. Quite literally, it means the East. But in the mindset of Edward Said's understanding, the Orient is basically other places that we don't see as part of our area. So I used the example earlier on of Great Britain and Australia. Now, Australia is far, far away, but there is a certain degree of cultural linkage between Australia and Ireland and Britain. We don't really see Australia as being an other place, a place that's radically different to our place. Whereas places like Kazakhstan, like Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, places that mightn't be as far away as Australia, but they're places that are culturally far away, places that we perceive as being very different to our places. And this is what Gregory talks about in the book. He talks about the knock-on effects of those, how this was used as part of the imperialist project, particularly in the 1800s. Basically, he talks about how Westerners created an imaginative geography of the Orient, kind of these stereotypes, these representations of places in the Orient. He talks about how Egypt was represented to Westerners as part of the project. So the idea that Orientals, people who were seen to be people who were associated with these other places, the Orientals were presented as others. So talking about a creation of an us and them, and the idea of others, I'll come back to this next week when I talk about critical geographies, is one of the key trends or strands running through a lot of geographical thought, not just in post-colonial geography, in other parts of postmodern geography. You'll also see it running through critical geographies as well. So the idea of others, representation, others, stereotypes. So according to Said and Gregory, the Orientals were presented as others who had different cultures to the West, but also, and we mentioned this when we looked at environmental, we mentioned this when we were talking about environmental determinism back at the end of September, in early October, the idea that these others had different cultures, but also inferior cultures. And ultimately, as we saw with determinism, creating a pretext that would allow for a justification for imperialism. Look, these poor suckers. That's not the right term, but that's probably the way that's the way people in the 1800s were thinking about it. Look at these poor people. They're very underdeveloped. Oh, they're not making the use of their land. They're not making the use of their resources. You know what? We should go in and help them by taking over their land, etc., and imposing Western civilization on them. And this was a worldview that in the 1800s was transmitted to home audiences by geographical societies. I'm not talking here about the Geographical Society of Ireland, because that came after this, but I'm talking here about the French, the Société Géographie de Paris, the Royal Geographical Society. So basically, explorers would go, they'd come back with these stories about places like Egypt, Tanzania, Kenya, transmit this knowledge or their perceptions or their stories back to audiences back in France or Britain, and ultimately creating the information, but also the justification that allowed for the last phase of imperialism, the scramble for Africa in the late 1800s. So this is Edward Said's book, as I said, 1978, isn't it? Orientalism, and talks about how the colonies were imagined by how imaginative geographies of the colonies were created by Western powers, particularly in the 1800s. The term the people beyond the pale, people who were different, outside Western norms, and ultimately, in the mindset then of the Western powers, ultimately creating a justification for bringing these lands and territories within the control of Western imperial powers. So, Said's Orientalism, that's the key book associated with post-colonial thought. As it says there from the slide, it examined the writings, diaries, photographs, paintings, and speeches of 19th century and early 21st century Western scholars, travellers and journalists, and statespeople, with respect to the Arab world, which incorporates, as you well know yourself, the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of Asia. So for Said, who are the Orientalists? The Orientalists were the Western commentators who, as he claimed, participated in the creation of stereotypes, of representations of this part of the world, the creation of sweeping generalizations and falsehoods. Orientalism was the worldview they created, and the Oriental was the person subjected to crude and misleading stereotypes. Now, this notion or this tendency to try and stereotype groups that you see yourself as being in conflict with, or groups that you see yourself as being different to, was part and parcel of the worldview of many Western powers in the 19th century or the 1800s, at a point in time where British views of Ireland were definitely less positive than they are today. You did see some very crude stereotypes being created of Ireland and Irish people in Britain in the 1800s, particularly around the time of the Home Rule movement. Like, look at these Irish, like, they want Home Rule, but like, really? If you left them to look after themselves, the place would descend into anarchy. Sure, all they're doing, you get the same common image being created of Irish people. The man with the hat over, you never see his eyes, the hat over his eyes, and usually other stereotypes usually refer to the Irish as being drunken and unruly. So post-colonial geography, as I said, the big inspiration is the work of Edward Said. And the big idea in post-colonial geography draws on the work of Edward Said. So it puts forward the idea that the stereotypes that are created about places are as powerful, or perhaps even more powerful, than the reality of those places. So the way that places are imagined, the way that stereotypes are created about places, have more of an impact on the mind, the imaginations and the mindset of people in the West than the reality of those places. Because in a lot of cases, surprise, surprise, people in the West don't really know much about those places. As it says there, post-colonial geographers are interested in how the West seeks to represent, imagine and depict and project its superiority. As Gregory talks, he says, who invented the story that West is best? Who put it into the world? What work does it do in the world? Who benefits from it? And how does it survive and prosper over time? How does the West conjure up colonial others to confirm the illusion of its superiority? So in the colonial present, Gregory suggests that colonialism isn't just a political and economic process. He says what's more important is, as important, is colonialism as a cultural process. He talks about the use of imaginative geographies as part of this process. He says, imaginative geographies help, as he says, to fold distance into difference. So places that are far away, places we know very little about, this sense of distance. As I said already, probably a sense of cultural distance sometimes can be as significant or powerful as a sense of geographical distance. How cultural distance ultimately gets folded into difference, ultimately creating partitions that demarcate us from them, the same from other, and can, at times of war, help to solidify what he calls architectures of enmity. For Gregory, imaginative geographies are performances. They ultimately act to produce the effects that they name. So if an imaginative geography is created that sees another place as different, as dangerous, this can actually help ultimately to produce that effect. That basically people see that place, in the mindsets of people, that place ultimately just becomes associated with difference, but also associated with danger, and ultimately helping to spark these architectures of enmity, if I'm saying that right. In the book, Gregory talks about the strategic moves of the USA and other Western powers, how geography plays a role. He talks about locating. So at the time, in the wake of 9/11, locating was a process used to make the enemy visible. So Al-Qaeda, as an enemy group, were very hard to locate. But once Al-Qaeda got associated with Afghanistan, this ultimately made it an easier process to make the enemy visible. He talks about the use of a technical register to identify targets. Opposing is basically, again, a lot of what we're talking about, the creation of stereotypes. Using stereotypes or representations to ultimately schematize the enemy as an other, which often also ties into the use of the clash of civilizations concept. Casting out then, ultimately presenting certain members of these other groups as ultimately outside the rule of law. And this is where you get to the political juridical register. So in the wake of 9/11, in the wake of the war in Iraq, the idea of homosassia, the idea that some people could be viewed as unlawful combatants, to whom the rule of law no longer applied. And creation of spaces of the exception, so Guantanamo Bay, where spaces of exception where the normal rule of law was effectively suspended, where anything could go in terms of the non-application of the rule of law. In the Gregory's book, he critiques the assumption that the West and modern culture has a monopoly of truth. And this is a common trend running through post-colonial geography. He calls for the reader of the book to understand the different ways in which imaginative geographies are acting, how they've acted in the past to allow for the creation of Western empires, but how they're acting in the present to create what he calls the colonial present. And he suggests that we need to explore other spatializations to turn our imaginative geographies into geographical imaginations that can enlarge and enhance our sense of the world. So part of this would be to try and also tap into other worldviews. So how do people in Africa view the world? What's their way of viewing the world? What's the way that people in Asia view the world? So the idea of tapping into other ways of thinking geographically, of understanding the world. Now, modern feminist geography. So we moved away from a few weeks ago, I spoke about radical feminist geography, which was the emergence of feminist geographies, the first strand in feminist geographies, what we now know as contemporary feminist geography. Contemporary feminist geographies. I have to keep remembering the plural. It's geographies, not geography. So feminist geographies. One of the focuses in modern day feminist geography is looking at the way that powerful groups often view places from what's called a helicopter view. So a helicopter view is basically looking at places almost like you're looking at them from above. You've got this privileged position looking down on these places. And ultimately, you're not really looking at these places in any great detail. You're just kind of getting the broad stroke view of the places. If you're looking at a town from, say, a mile above, you're only going to get a kind of the broad stroke view of the town, a very basic understanding. Sometimes, though, it's a privileged understanding because, in your view, okay, that's the way I look on the place, so that's the way I'm going to present and represent the place. Feminist geographers see this helicopter view as basically being a masculinist way of trying to make sense of the world. By contrast, and this is one of the changes you see from radical feminist geography, which has said, radical feminist geography has said had issues and problems with place, particularly the romanticization of home places. Contemporary feminist geographies, however, are interested in the nitty-gritty of places. So feminist geographers try to move away from this attempt to try and impose helicopter views of places. They say it's important to get involved, immersed in the nitty-gritty of places, and recognizing that these places can only ever be known partially. So the idea of only ever being known partially, you'll never fully understand the place, particularly if you're someone who's an outsider, someone who's coming into that place for the first time. One of the key trends running through feminist geography or feminist geographies in the 21st century is intersectionality. And this looks at how inequalities related to gender, such as gender-based description, links in or overlaps with other categories such as class, race, sexuality. So the idea that you're not just focusing on gender-based inequalities, you're looking at how these play out when they're linking in with other things, with other factors, how these link in with other discriminated groups. So the idea that the experience of discrimination for a white woman living in New York may be very different to that for a black woman living in New York. How the experience of discrimination for people in the West, women living in the West, can be very different to that for people living in other parts of the world. So as Evans and Madrill says, feminist geographers continue to reveal the links between intersectional gender and wider structural inequalities and negotiate the dialectical tensions of specific local and intersectional gender inequalities, such as access to food and healthcare, refugee quotas and care, the gender pay gap, domestic violence, online trolling, while championing innovative geographical studies of gendered spaces and practices, such as those associated with children's geographies, the home and body. So ultimately, the trend in feminist geographies in the 1990s and 2000s, ultimately, it's a move away from the old, largely structuralist approaches of radical feminist geography to a focus instead on intersectionality and on geographies of difference, ultimately looking at how gender-based inequalities interact and play out in terms of how they're shaped by other factors such as nationalism, racism, and imperialism, and how they link in with other categories, other forms of discrimination as well. Some key study areas that contemporary feminist geographies have made notable contributions to include geographies of fear, feminist geographies of nature, feminist geographies of mobility, and feminist geographies of development. Looking at feminist geographies of nature, there's a number of different trends here. So this is interesting. Feminist geographers don't necessarily all agree on the links between feminism and nature. You'll see a very different perspective between the eco-feminist view and the views of other feminist geographers. Gillian Rose basically sees Western thought, a dualistic trend running through Western thought. She sees it dividing Western thought and geography into two unequal halves. So she talks about, on the one hand, divisions between men and women, and she says these can be looked on as being similar to the divisions between nature and culture. So sometimes there's a likening or linkage created between women and nature in terms of women being discriminated, in terms of the division between men and women, nature being discriminated in terms of the division between culture and nature. The ecofeminist view or ecofeminist perspective argues that the linkages or the associations that can be created between women and women's bodies and the natural world can be used as a means of critiquing what's seen as the cold, unnatural, rational trends running through masculinity. So the ecofeminist view would see women as having a privileged position to be able to critique ecological destruction or environmental destruction and protest ecological destruction. Not all feminist geographers buy into the ecofeminist views. People like Gillian Rose basically say, we won't play nature to your culture. Joni Seeger, for instance, critiques the ecofeminist view and the Mother Earth metaphor, claiming that women's special position in relation to nature is probably shaped more by their position in an unequal world. In her book, Earth Follies, Seeger points to the masculinist nature of the institutions responsible for degrading nature, while she also notes that women are usually amongst the people who are most impacted by the impacts of environmental damage and environmental degradation. Okay, moving on to the applied strands running through modern contemporary geography. So I'm going to say a bit about applied geography and then I'll say a little bit about modern quantitative geography. So applied geography as an approach is very much associated with a Scottish-based geographer called Michael Paccioni. Applied geography can be defined as the application of geographical knowledge and skills to the resolution of social, economic, and environmental problems. And part of what's involved here is a suggestion that you can get a division between what's called pure geography or professional geography and applied geography or policy geography. So pure or professional geography is seen as geography which seeks to understand the processes that create spatial patterns of human and natural phenomena. Pure geography is probably more academic geography. Sometimes it has a stronger theoretical strand. Applied or policy geography is geography that seeks to assist policymakers in solving the spatial dimensions of the big social, economic, and environmental challenges of the modern world. So there's a difference suggested there between academic, pure professional geography and more hands-on applied policy geography. There is a philosophy underpinning applied geography, and that philosophy is called American pragmatism. Ultimately, I won't go into this in too much detail, but ultimately the big idea of American pragmatism is that a theory has value only if it works. If a theory is seen to work, then the argument is keep using that theory. If the theory is seen as no longer working, then that's fair enough, discard the theory, try another theory. So at its simplest, the worldview of American pragmatism, something is only true only insofar as it works. So ultimately, as it says there, the meaning of a concept or the truth of a proposition is to be evaluated by considering the experiential or practical consequences of its application. If a theory or an idea is working, keep using it. If a theory or idea isn't working or is no longer working, then it's okay to discard it and we'll try a different theory. Ultimately, it's a worldview, it's a way of looking on the world that isn't particularly ideological. It's not tied up with certain ideologies. So perhaps one of the, and this is a kind of a big debating point, one of the more positive points that could be argued is it's not tied into certain philosophies. Obviously, if you're looking at applied geography from other worldviews, say a Marxist worldview, a Marxist geographer wouldn't like this, obviously, because if you're looking at the world from a Marxist worldview, everything is ultimately seen through the mindset of Marxism. Someone from the applied geography tradition would say, no, I don't think that theory works. I will try another theory. So it isn't a particularly ideological approach. It's quite postmodern in that if a theory works, it works. If it doesn't, get rid of it. Try something else. Now, pure and applied geography in the history of the subject. This is Mark Boyle's way of understanding it. So he suggests that between the 1880s and 1920s, the subject was dominated by applied geography. Applied geography ultimately where geography was seen to be useful, but seen to be useful to politicians, particularly in the late 1800s, particularly useful in the service of empire. So the idea in between the 1880s and 1920s was that applied geography was quite dominant. There was a sense amongst geographers that geography should be relevant, but particularly relevant to politicians, particularly relevant to the interests of their own state. And at that point in time, you're looking at states such as Britain, France, Germany, states that were involved in the creation of or in the enlargement of their empires in other parts of the world, but particularly Africa in the late 1800s. Boyle suggests then when you move from the 20s to the 40s, applied geography as such disappears. And it disappears a bit during a big crisis, two big crises. The Great Depression of the late 1920s and the early 1930s, and World War II. Regional geography as such, really not a very strong applied dimension to it. You can think of arguments for and against regional geography, but in terms of the usefulness of regional geography, in terms of the relevance of regional geography, there's a lot of questions that you might ask about it. So there's a sense that in the first part of the 1900s, the pendulum swung away from applied geography towards pure geography, towards geography for geography's sake. Now, in the 1950s and 1960s, the argument is that applied geography once again came to the fore with the emergence of spatial science, an approach to geography that did seek to make geography useful once again, that did seek to create problem solvers who could then go on to form part of the workforce in the increasingly complex economies and politics and societies of the Western world in the wake of World War II. The mid-1970s, with The relative decline of spatial science, the emergence of Marxist geography, of humanistic geography, there's a general sense that applied geography went missing once again. And Mark Boyle makes the point that applied geography generally seems to go missing at certain points of time when there's major crises impacting the world. So the Great Depression, World War II in the 1930s and 1940s. In the 1970s, the big recession, the global oil crisis, the big economic recession of the 1970s. And then from the 1980s to the 2000s, I suggest that there's a re-emergence of applied geography with the emergence of geographical information systems and geocomputation. Now, that's an interesting take on it. Now, I'll put in a caveat here. In the 1880s, late 1800s, early 1900s, it's definitely true to say that applied approaches to geography were dominant in the subject. The same could be said about the era of spatial science in the 1950s and 1960s. Are applied approaches to geography particularly dominant in the 2000s? I don't think so. I think applied geography as an approach, in terms of where power lies within academic geography, I think applied approaches to geography, they're very much marginal as such. I don't think it would be, I don't think you could claim that applied geography is a dominant strand running through postmodern geography. I think a lot of postmodern geography is quite, very much along the lines of pure professional geography. And if you're looking for a dominant strand within geography in the 21st century, I would suggest that it's not applied geography. I would suggest it's more likely to be critical geographies as opposed to applied geography. And I'll talk about critical geographies next Monday. So relevance and geographies. The idea of applied geography opens up a lot of questions about relevance and geography. So there's quotes there from Johnson, Mitchell, and Staley. I'll let you read them yourself. But ultimately, there's a big debate within geography about relevance. Should geography be relevant? If it's relevant, who should it be relevant for? So you'll see this in the quotes there. Why should research be relevant? Why should research be relevant? How does it become relevant? For whom should it be relevant? So should geography be relevant? That's the big question. And this is one of the issues facing people like David Harvey. David Harvey, writing there in the 1970s, raises some issues with geography. He raises some issues with people arguing that geography should be relevant. The point he makes is, well, who's it going to be relevant for? Marxist geographers would critique applied geography because they would say, well, who is this geography relevant for? It's relevant for certain interest groups. And the big example used is work done by geographers in terms of locating, deciding new locations for supermarkets. Is that of particular value? So is geography, who should geography be relevant for? And it's a big debate running through geography today. Who should geography be relevant for? Sorry about that, one drink of water later. Who or what should geography be relevant for? The Marxist critical geography's viewpoint is that geographers shouldn't be involved in things like, as I said, deciding the locations of new shopping centres and other things. The counter to that, I would argue, is that not everyone is going to be involved in social action. And the counter to that is that geography students have to eat as well. So that maybe some of you may be actually end up applying your geographical skills. And maybe you will be applying your geographical skills to questions such as, where should a new supermarket be located? Or where should a business be located? Is that a good or a bad thing? I think it generally depends on your worldview. But ultimately, once you get out into the big bad world, sometimes the way to think about it is a job is a job. The last trend then, the rise of big data and geo-computation. So Mark put this slide together looking at all the different sources of geographical information that's available today. So if you cast your mind back to when I started talking about spatial science, it feels like years ago now. It's probably only the start of October. One of the points I made about early spatial science was it didn't have a lot of computing power. It found it very difficult to access information, but it also found it very difficult to put all that information into models. So that's why you got the simplification of models that we talked about way back a few weeks ago, when we talked about the isotropic plane assumption, the economic man assumption, and so on. What we've seen in the 2000s in particular is a move from small data. So in the 1940s and 1950s, you were dealing with small data. You had people who were doing their calculations, generally in their office, by hand. You were looking at geographers operating in spatial science, trying to create statistical models, but they had very limited computing power. So generally, instead of trying to incorporate a large number of variables or a large number of different factors into their models, they're trying to simplify their models so that they were ultimately, in a lot of cases, just looking at one or two different factors. And that required them to make a lot of assumptions about the world, where they just tried to simplify the world in terms of the worldview of people, the landscape, in order to be able to make their models work in the 40s and 50s. In the modern world, you don't need to make those assumptions anymore. We've moved from small data to big data. It's huge in volume. There's loads of data. It's high in velocity. You can have loads of data being moved from A to B, from different parts of the world, almost in real time. So in the old days, 1940s, if you heard there was a really good book of data in Australia, how would you get that? You'd write to a friendly geographer in Australia and say, "Dear friend, would you mind sending me that book?" You'd wait a few months for the letter to get to Australia, and then you'd wait for a few months for the book to come back from Australia, and you'd find that because you didn't express yourself correctly, he sent you the wrong book. Nowadays, you can just get data, boom, 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 effectively in real time, huge amounts of data. It's diverse in variety, some structured, some unstructured. Now, this is the point. It's exhaustive in scope. It's almost capturing everything around the world at this stage. So in the old days, you were talking about getting samples of populations. Nowadays, you don't need samples of population. You can just pump in all the data into the supercomputers. Well, you can pump all the data into your phone. It's almost the same thing now. What we would call the supercomputers in the 80s, 90s. Now your phone does the same work of those 1980s supercomputers. And you can effectively capture the whole population nowadays. You don't need to worry about sample size anymore or that. It's fine-grained in resolution, uniquely indexable in identification. It's relational in nature, containing common fields that allow different data sets to be joined together. And last of all, it's flexible. It can be you can apply extensionality, so you can add new data easily to existing data sets. And scalability, you can rapidly increase the size of data sets rapidly. So ultimately, the world has changed. The quantitative geography today, it's a different world. You're no longer trying to develop models. You're no longer trying to develop laws. You're now trying to make sense of reality. You're trying to harness all this data, this huge amount of data, this exhaustive amount of data, and using that to try and ultimately see what are the trends, try to make sense of the real world. Now, the final slide I'm going to leave you with today is what Mark Boyle sees as four key developments in geography in the 2000s. Now, I'm going to suggest he's leaving out the most important development at all as relates to academic geography. I think that is critical geographies. I'm going to talk about critical geographies in next Monday's lecture, but these are the four things Mark sees as the key developments in geography in the 21st century. So he sees postmodern geography, which he sees as including post-structural geography, postcolonial geography, feminist geography, emotional geographies, and geographies associated with non-representational theory. He suggests it's the object of analysis that counts. So he suggests that there could be hints of a return to a society and nature focus within geography. Another trend he suggests, it's the usefulness of geography that counts. So he suggests that there could be potentially a re-emergence of applied geography, particularly in neoliberal economies. Finally, he suggests that you could see the end of theory, geography after the end of the age of theory. He suggests that the scale of big data in the world today with the scale of big data in the world today, you may get to a point that you no longer need theories because all the answers is in the data, which he suggests could potentially mark the end of all approaches in geography. So that's ultimately the way Mark sees the trends in geography in the 2000s. Now I'm going to counter this argument, and I'm going to suggest in next Monday's lecture that there is another key trend running through modern geography. And I think it's probably the most, if you look at where the power currently lies within academic geography, particularly in the Western world, including countries like Ireland, I think it's probably the most significant trend in modern 21st century human geography, and that's critical geographies. So I'll talk about that in next Monday's lecture. But anyway, in the space of an hour and 6 minutes, I've given you a full week's worth of lectures. So I don't know whether you call that value for money or you call that being shortchanged. But as I said, all these different approaches I covered today, the most significant ones probably being feminist geographies, post-structural geographies, post-colonial geographies. I'm only giving you a broad brushstroke. So definitely the lectures are always meant to be starting points, and the idea is you move on then to get a little bit more detail on these approaches when you try to read and engage a bit more with some of the recommended readings. Now, as I said, I know it's the end of November. It's the time of year. It's not the most wonderful time of year. It's not. It's definitely not. It's the time of year where all your big assignment deadlines start to pour in. So this mightn't be the best time of year to be doing extra readings, but if you're once you get past the assignment deadlines and once all the big assignment deadlines are out of the way and you're starting to get more into exam preparation mode or the exam preparation mindset, and I'd say try to get into that as soon as you can. I'm not saying you should be swatting and studying for exams from maybe the 9th of December right up to the middle of January, because everyone deserves a bloody Christmas break. But what I'm saying is, if you're finished all your big assignments by, say, with a week to go or even 2 weeks to go before the end of the term, use those last 2 weeks cleverly and smartly and try to get as much work done for the exams as you can in those last 2 weeks. That means then you don't have to be worrying about doing this work over Christmas. You don't need to be worrying about catching up on work after Christmas. You can get a bloody break at Christmas, and everyone needs a bloody break at Christmas, even the miserable lecturers and anyone else. So yeah, if you do find a bit of space between now and the end of the semester, once all the big assignment deadlines are out of the way, try to get some of the recommended readings done that you mightn't have been able to do this week or next week because of the big road blockages with assignment. Anyway, I've talked enough, guys. I'm waffling here now at the moment, and I'll leave it at that. So, toodaloo.